the previous part, we exposed the 86-day rush to judgment and the digital black holes that the district attorney chose to ignore. We proved that the official investigation was dangerously incomplete. But in this part, we are turning our attention to the one man who tried to tell us the truth when no one else would listen. For 8 years, Alan Gray, known as the Armchair Detective, was ridiculed for claiming he saw a shadow moving under Chris Watts' truck. The experts called it a glitch. The world called him paranoid. However, with the release of secret WhatsApp logs and cell tower pings in 2026, the laughter has stopped. Today, we are forced to confront a terrifying question: did a man sitting behind a computer screen see the invisible accomplice long before the police did? It is time to vindicate the doubt. So, let us go back to the immediate aftermath of the murders in late 2018. The world was paralyzed by a single, horrifying narrative. We were told that Christopher Watts, a mild-mannered father, simply snapped. We were told that under the pressure of financial ruin and a disintegrating marriage, he had a psychotic break and annihilated his entire family in a singular act of rage. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the Weld County District Attorney all signed off on this story. They wrapped it up in just 86 days, calling it a tragic, but simple, case of a family annihilator, acting alone. But, across the ocean in the United Kingdom, a man named Alan Gray was watching the same footage, reading the same discovery files, and shaking his head. To the internet, he was just the Armchair Detective, a YouTuber with a grainy webcam and a controversial opinion. But while the rest of the world saw a monster hiding behind a mask of sanity, Alan Gray saw something else. He saw a fool. The thing is, Gray's central thesis from the very beginning was controversial, because it insulted the intelligence of the killer. He argued that Chris Watts was too passive, too conflict avoidant, and quite frankly, too stupid to execute a crime of this magnitude without guidance. Gray looked at the clumsy way the bodies were disposed of, the bizarre television interviews, and the disjointed timeline, and he concluded that Chris did not fit the profile of a mastermind. He famously claimed, "Chris Watts is not smart enough to do this alone. Someone helped him. Someone directed him." At that time, the backlash was severe. The public, still grieving for Shannon, Bella, and Celeste, viewed Gray's theories as an attempt to shift blame or create a conspiracy where none existed. The authorities dismissed him entirely. The Federal Bureau of Investigation treated the accomplice theory as internet noise, a distraction from their slam-dunk confession. The consensus was clear: there was no puppet master, only a murderer. Alan Gray was labeled a nuisance, a man seeing ghosts in the machine, selling false hope to a family desperate for a different answer. However, fast forward to 2026, and the silence from Dodge Correctional Institution has finally broken. And what is leaking out of that prison cell makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. New letters and reports surfacing from Chris Watts paint a picture that aligns terrifyingly well with what Alan Gray was screaming about 8 years ago. What I found was that Chris is no longer protecting Nichol Kessinger. In these new communications, he uses biblical and venomous language to describe her role. He refers to her as a Jezebel. He claims that he was manipulated into believing that his family was the only obstacle to his freedom. But it goes deeper than just blame. He is describing a dynamic of total control. And this is important, because Chris is now claiming that the digital cleanup, the deletion of his Facebook, the scrubbing of his phone, was not his idea. He claims Kessinger instructed him to do it. He describes a scenario where he was following a script, acting under the intense pressure of a woman who told him to fix the situation if he wanted a future with her. Which tells us that Alan Gray's psychological profile of the crime was actually more accurate than the official one. The police saw a man who acted alone. Gray saw a man who was incapable of acting alone. Gray realized that Chris Watts was a follower by nature, a man who moved from his mother's control to his wife's control, and then, tragically, to his mistress's control. The reason this matters is that it redefines what we mean by seeing things. For years, we mocked the armchair detective for looking for physical shadows under a truck. We laughed when he analyzed pixelated glitches. But we missed the forest for the trees. His visual evidence might have been shaky, but his intuition was razor sharp. He sensed the presence of a second will, a second consciousness in that timeline. Long before Chris Watts admitted that he was being directed. In other words, the authorities closed the case based on physical forensics, but they completely ignored the psychological forensics. They were so happy to have a confession that they didn't bother to ask if the mouth speaking the words belonged to a puppet. Alan Gray asked that question. And now, in 2026, as we read Chris's claims that she planned everything, we have to admit the uncomfortable truth. The crazy YouTuber on the internet saw the strings of manipulation 8 years before the rest of us even knew where to look. He saw the invisible hand that was guiding the killer, and for that, he was ridiculed. But who is laughing now? What I found was that for 8 years, the credibility of the armchair detective hung on a single, fragile thread, a cluster of grainy pixels in a black and white security video. If you were online in 2018, you remember the image. It was 5:17 in the morning. The camera at Nate Trenastich's house captured Chris Watts backing his truck into the driveway. To the naked eye, it was just a truck moving in the dark. But Alan Gray froze that frame. He zoomed in until the image broke apart into blocks of digital noise. He pointed to a faint, shifting darkness near the rear tire and told the world, "Look. There is someone hiding there. There is a second person." He was convinced that the shadow was Nichol Kessinger, lying in wait, slipping into the vehicle or handing something to Chris. The thing is, the experts tore him apart. Forensic video analysts explained that low-resolution cameras create artifacts, ghosts, caused by compression algorithms struggling to process movement in low light. They called it pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to see faces and figures where none exist. They said Alan Gray was chasing a phantom. They said the shadow was just a trick of the light, a glitch in the matrix. And for a long time, it seemed like they were right. After all, you cannot convict someone based on a smudge of gray pixels. However, in 2026, the conversation has shifted. We are no longer looking at the video, we are looking at the data. And the data tells us that while Alan Gray might have been wrong about the pixels, he was absolutely right about the presence. What struck me here was a specific piece of evidence that was buried in the discovery files, but never fully contextualized until now. On the morning of August 13th, while Chris Watts was allegedly acting alone, the digital footprint of his mistress was screaming otherwise. We now know that at 6:16 in the morning, less than an hour after that infamous truck pulled away, Nichol Kessinger's phone pinged off a cell tower in Frederick, Colorado. The reason this matters is geography. Frederick is a small town. The tower that picked up her signal covers the specific red zone surrounding the Watts family home. At that hour, Nichol Kessinger claimed she was miles away in Northglenn, getting ready for work, completely oblivious to the crime. But cell towers do not lie. Her phone was not in Northglenn. It was in Frederick. It was reaching out and shaking hands with a tower that stood in the shadow of the crime scene. Which tells us that the armchair detective possessed a terrifying kind of intuition. He spent years pointing at a shadow under a truck, insisting, "She is there. She is there." The skeptics laughed because they couldn't see a face. But the digital reality proves that she was there, or at least, her device was. In other words, the shadow under the truck might have been an optical illusion, but it was a prophetic one. It was a visual manifestation of a digital truth. Alan Gray sensed the anomaly. He sensed that the lone wolf narrative was physically impossible, and he projected that suspicion onto the only visual evidence he had. He was right about the who and the where. He was just early on the how. At this point, you have to ask yourself a question that defies standard logic. Is it possible for a human being, sitting thousands of miles away, staring at a computer screen, to pick up on the energy of a crime scene better than the investigators standing on the front lawn? The problem is, we dismissed him because his evidence looked like a conspiracy theory. We ignored the shadow because it was blurry, but the ping is not blurry. It is a hard data point that places the mistress in the vicinity of the murders at the exact time the cover-up was unfolding. So, perhaps we owe the armchair detective an apology. He told us there was a second person in the dark that morning. He told us Chris Watts wasn't alone. And now, 8 years later, the cell towers of Frederick are finally whispering back, he was right. And then, we have to talk about the most iconic moment of this entire tragedy, the moment that burned itself into the retina of anyone who was watching the news in August of 2018. It is the porch interview. You remember the image. Christopher Watts standing there on his driveway, wearing that Carolina Tar Heels t-shirt, arms crossed tightly over his chest, swaying back and forth while he pleaded for his wife and children to come home. To the Federal Bureau of Investigation, this was the behavior of a liar crumbling under pressure. To the general public, it was a bad acting performance by a guilty husband. But Alan Gray, the armchair detective, saw something else entirely. He did not look at Chris's mouth. He looked at his eyes. In dozens of frame-by-frame analysis videos, Alan Gray pointed out a bizarre tic that made him the laughingstock of the internet for years. He noticed that every few sentences, Chris would dart his eyes rapidly to the left, looking toward the garage or a specific spot off camera. Gray practically screamed in his videos. Look. He is looking at someone. He is looking for approval. He is waiting for direction. He is not acting alone. The thing is, back in 2018, this theory was treated as absurdity. The experts mocked him. They said, Alan, you are crazy. There is no one standing there. That is just the nervous reflex of a man who knows he is caught. The police dismissed it too. They believed Chris was a lone wolf, acting entirely on his own volition, and that those glances were just internal panic, not external communication. However, fast forward to 2026, when the secrets from Dodge Correctional Institution finally leaked, and the testimony of Chris's former cellmate, Dylan Tallman, surfaced, we suddenly realized a terrifying truth: Alan Gray was right. There may not have been a person standing there in the flesh, but there was absolutely an invisible communicator present in Chris's mind. What I found was a massive digital black hole that law enforcement ignored for 8 years. According to these new revelations, Chris Watts admitted that he and Nichol Kessinger were not just using the secret calculator app to store pictures. They were communicating using WhatsApp. This detail changes everything. The problem is, in the nearly 2,000 pages of the official discovery file, there is not a single mention of a warrant served to WhatsApp. The police were so focused on the calculator app because that is where the nude photos were found. They thought they had found the smoking gun. But they were wrong. They missed the command center. Which means thousands of lines of dialogue have vanished into thin air. And this is exactly where the tangled strings that the armchair detective sensed were hiding. Think about this from a criminal psychology perspective. If Chris and Nichol were using WhatsApp, an app known for end-to-end encryption, to talk, what were they discussing? You do not use a secret, encrypted channel to talk about the weather. You use it to discuss plans that cannot be traced. You use it to give instructions that must not be found. At this point, let us go back to Chris's eyes on that porch. When Alan Gray said, he is waiting for direction, he touched on the very essence of this relationship. Chris Watts, by his own admission in prison letters, was a follower. He describes being manipulated and led. He was a man who needed a script, and that script, in all likelihood, was sitting right in his pocket, inside the phone containing the WhatsApp application that the police never unlocked. The connection is terrifying. The invisible connection that the armchair detective saw in Chris's body language was real. He was not looking at a physical person. He was looking at the memory of the instructions he had been given. He was acting like a puppet whose strings were woven from thousands of text messages, messages of direction, manipulation, and coaching that he had received via WhatsApp before the cameras ever started rolling. Chris kept glancing away, not just because he was nervous, but because he was subconsciously checking his programming. What did she tell me to say? How did she tell me to act? In other words, Alan Gray saw the psychological dependency of Chris Watts on Nichol Kessinger through his body language, a detail that professional investigators missed because they were too busy looking for physical evidence. He saw an invisible prompter, and the data from 2026 regarding WhatsApp confirms that this prompter existed. She was not standing behind the camera, but she had programmed his mind through a secret channel that justice forgot to check. So, the next time you watch that interview, do not laugh when you see Chris glance to the side. Shudder. Because the armchair detective was right. He was not standing there alone. He was carrying the orders of another person. Someone who taught him how to delete his history, but forgot to teach him how to hide the fear in his eyes. So, we have talked about the shadows under the truck, and we have talked about the invisible strings of communication. But now, we have to turn our attention to the person at the other end of those strings. We have to talk about Nichol Kessinger. In the official narrative sold to the public by the district attorney in 2018, Nichol was the ultimate victim of circumstance. She was portrayed as a young woman who was deceived, lied to, and blindsided by a man she thought was separating from his wife. When the truth came out, we were told she was horrified and cooperated fully to help put a monster behind bars. But Alan Gray refused to swallow that pill. He watched the hours of police interrogation footage released in the Discovery dump, and he saw something that made his blood run cold. He didn't see a traumatized victim. He saw a performer. In his videos, the armchair detective dissected her demeanor with surgical precision. He pointed out how she sat there, casually eating fast food while discussing the disappearance of a pregnant woman and 2 toddlers. He highlighted the lack of genuine tears. He focused on how she carefully curated her answers, often looking to her father, who was bizarrely allowed in the room, for cues on what to say. Gray famously declared, "She is not a victim. She knows everything. She is acting." At that time, this was considered the most toxic of all his theories, to accuse a cooperating witness of being a mastermind or a cold-blooded calculator was seen as harassment. The internet mob attacked him. They said he was misogynistic. They said he was revictimizing an innocent woman who was lucky to escape with her life. They told him to leave her alone. However, in 2026, the data has finally caught up with the intuition, and what we found in the recovered digital forensic reports proves that Alan Gray's assessment of her character was not just accurate, it was an understatement. What I found was a series of Google searches that destroy the innocent victim narrative once and for all. These searches were deleted, wiped from her phone in a desperate attempt to scrub history, but modern forensic tools have pulled them back from the digital grave. According to the unsealed files, on August 19, 2018, while the bodies of Bella and Celeste were still being identified in the oil tanks, Nichol Kessinger wasn't searching for grief counseling. She wasn't searching for how to help a grieving family. She was searching for Amber Frey. For those who don't know, Amber Frey was the mistress of Scott Peterson, another famous family annihilator. But Nichol wasn't just looking up who she was. She was searching for Amber Frey book deal. She was searching for, how much money did Amber Frey make? She was Googling, did people like Amber Frey? The thing is, let that sink in. While the world was weeping for those children, Nichol Kessinger was calculating her net worth. She was looking at this tragedy not as a horror, but as a career opportunity. She was researching the market value of being a famous mistress. Which tells us that Alan Gray was right. When he looked at her face in those interview videos and said, "She is cold," he wasn't imagining it. He was seeing the face of a woman who was already thinking about her book deal, while the police were still thinking about the autopsies. The acting that Gray pointed out was real. She was playing the role of the concerned citizen, but behind her eyes, she was auditioning for fame. But it gets darker. The armchair detective also claimed she was hiding evidence. He said, "She knows more than she is saying." And once again, the search history from 2026 vindicates him. We now know that before she ever went to the police, she searched for, can cops trace text messages? And how long do phone companies keep records? The reason this matters is intent. An innocent person does not worry about the police tracing their texts. An innocent person hands over their phone and says, "Look at everything." A guilty person, or at least, a person who knows they are complicit in the psychological destruction of a family, worries about what can be recovered. Alan Gray screamed from the rooftops that she was deleting evidence. The police ignored it. They gave her immunity. They treated her deletions as a mistake. But the search history proves it was a strategy. She was researching the limits of digital forensics because she had something to hide. In other words, the armchair detective was vilified for attacking a witness. But the reality is that he was the only one who saw her for what she truly was. He saw a woman who, while the rest of the world was paralyzed by the cruelty of Chris Watts, was busy wondering if she could get a lucrative brand ambassador contract out of the deal. At this point, we have to admit that Alan Gray's moral compass was pointing true north, while the investigator's compass was spinning in circles. He saw the mastermind, not necessarily in the physical act of murder, but in the cold, calculated management of the aftermath. He saw a woman who was calculating profit while the bodies were still warm. And if that isn't the definition of a villain, I don't know what is. That is when the story takes its most tragic and controversial turn. We cannot talk about the legacy of the armchair detective without talking about the people who clung to his theories the tightest, Ronnie and Cindy Watts, the parents of the killer. If you were watching this unfold in 2018, you remember the vitriol. The public hatred toward Chris's parents was almost as intense as the hatred for Chris himself. They were demonized for daring to suggest that their son, the man who confessed to annihilating his family, might have been framed, or at least, that he did not act alone. The thing is, Alan Gray became the lightning rod for this anger. He was accused of being a predator. The narrative in the media was that this YouTuber was exploiting a grieving, desperate couple. Critics said he was selling them false hope. They claimed he was feeding them delusions of a conspiracy just to keep his view counts high. People said it was cruel to let a mother believe her son was innocent when the evidence clearly showed he was a monster. But let us pause and look at this through the lens of 2026. What I found was that while the public was busy judging Cindy Watts for her denial, they were ignoring her intuition. A mother knows her child. Cindy knew that for 33 years, Chris was a passive, conflict-avoidant follower. She knew he did not have the dominant personality required to mastermind a triple homicide and a cover-up on his own. She sensed a shift in him the moment Nichol Kessinger entered his life. She called it a darkness. She felt, in her gut, that this woman was not just a girlfriend, but a catalyst. The reason this matters is that Alan Gray was the only person in the world who validated that instinct. He didn't tell them Chris was a saint. He told them, your son is weak, and someone strong was pulling the strings. And now, 8 years later, the letters leaking from Dodge Correctional Institution prove that Cindy Watts and the armchair detective were touching upon a truth that the rest of us were too angry to see. In other words, the false hope wasn't entirely false. It was just mislabeled. In the letters released in 2026, Chris Watts finally uses the language that his parents and Alan Gray had been using for years. He refers to Nichol Kessinger as Jezebel. He writes explicitly that he was manipulated. He claims that she was the one who planned everything. He describes a dynamic where he was psychologically dismantled, isolated from his family, and reprogrammed to believe that eliminating them was the only path to a new life. At this point, we have to reevaluate the relationship between the armchair detective and the Watts family. Alan Gray wasn't poisoning their minds. He was acting as a translator for their confusion. When Cindy Watts said, "She did this," and the world screamed, "No, he did," Alan Gray was the one who said, "Maybe they both did. Maybe he was the weapon, but she was the hand." What struck me here was the specific detail about the digital cleanup. Chris now claims that Kessinger instructed him to delete his Facebook and wipe his phone. This aligns perfectly with the parents' belief that Chris was following orders. They knew their son wasn't a criminal mastermind who knew how to scrub metadata. They knew he needed a teacher. The problem is, the world wanted a simple villain. We wanted Chris to be a born psychopath. But the parents, aided by the analysis of the armchair detective, saw a lead monster. A man who was capable of evil, yes, but who needed a push to cross the line. Which means that Alan Gray didn't sell them a lie. He sold them a version of the truth that was too complex for the justice system to process in 86 days. He validated the terrifying reality that their son was a monster, but he was a manufactured monster. However, this vindication is bitter. It doesn't absolve Chris. He still strangled Shannon. He still smothered Bella and Celeste. But it does absolve his parents of the accusation that they were crazy for suspecting an accomplice. And it absolves the armchair detective of the accusation that he was a con artist. So, when we look back at those phone calls between Alan Gray and the Watts family, we shouldn't see exploitation. We should see the only two groups of people, the parents and the digital sleuth, who were willing to confront the uncomfortable shadow standing next to Chris Watts. Cindy Watts felt a dark presence around her son. Alan Gray saw a shadow under the truck, and in 2026, Chris Watts finally admitted that they were both right. He was never alone in that darkness. The false hope was actually a premature realization of a horrifying partnership. Meanwhile, while the experts were debunking pixels and the media was moving on to the next headline, something remarkable was happening in the comments sections and forums of the internet. A movement was growing, and if we are being honest with ourselves, we have to acknowledge who planted the first seed. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't a journalist. It was the armchair detective. The thing is, when Alan Gray first pointed to that shadow under the truck and questioned the timeline, he did more than just create a conspiracy theory. He created a permission structure. He gave ordinary people permission to question the official narrative of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the district attorney. He told the world, it is okay to not believe what you are being told. What I found was that this skepticism didn't fade away when the ridicule started. Instead, it hardened. It organized. And by 2026, it has transformed from a chaotic internet mob into a sophisticated legal force. So, look at where we are today. In early 2026, we are seeing petitions with millions of signatures circulating internationally. These aren't just angry rants on social media anymore. Groups like Behind Criminal Minds are compiling structured legal briefs, analyzing metadata, and documenting the very contradictions that Alan Gray was screaming about 8 years ago. But you have to ask yourself, would any of this exist if the armchair detective hadn't been the first one to say, "Look closer"? If he hadn't spent hundreds of hours dissecting that footage, would millions of people have felt authorized to demand a reopening? He was the spark that lit the fire. He turned passive viewers into active investigators. And then, there is the most shocking development of all. The legacy of the armchair detective has moved from the computer screen to the ballot box. What happened next is something no one predicted in 2018. A former colleague of the creators behind this movement, an attorney, has moved to Fort Lupton, Colorado. He is quietly starting the exploratory process to run for Weld County District Attorney in the 2027 election. The reason this matters is that this isn't just a standard political campaign. This candidate has made a specific, behind-the-scenes commitment. If he wins, he has agreed to review the hundreds of pages of evidence that these citizen detectives have compiled. He has agreed to use that evidence to formally request reopening the investigation into Nichol Kessinger's involvement. In other words, the questions that Alan Gray raised in his living room. Questions about accomplices, about shadows, about hidden truths, are now shaping the political landscape of Colorado. A potential district attorney is running on a platform that essentially says, the internet sleuths might have been right. At this point, we have to recognize the shift. This is no longer just true crime entertainment. This is a civil justice revolution. The armchair detective label was meant to be an insult. It was meant to belittle people who investigate from their couches. But in 2026, those armchair detectives are the ones driving the legal strategy. They are the ones forcing the system to look at the digital footprints, the cell tower pings, and the deleted messages that the professionals ignored. The problem is, the establishment still wants to dismiss this. They want to say that internet investigations are dangerous. And yes, sometimes they can be. But in this case, the dangerous investigators were the ones who kept the case alive when the state wanted to bury it in 86 days. Which means that Alan Gray's legacy isn't just about whether the shadow under the truck was a child or a ghost. His legacy is the democratization of justice. He proved that you don't need a badge to find the truth, you just need eyes, obsession, and a refusal to accept the easy answer. So, when we see volunteers signing up to phone bank for this new district attorney candidate in late 2027, we aren't just seeing political activism. We are seeing the ripple effect of one man who dared to point at a screen and say, I see something you don't. All of the current legal pressure in 2026 stems from those initial doubts. If Alan Gray hadn't endured the mockery, the Watts case would be a dusty file on a shelf, forgotten by everyone except the family. Instead, it is a living, breathing battleground. He was never just a YouTuber. He was the unintended architect of a movement that is now knocking on the door of the courthouse, holding a file full of evidence that the police missed, and demanding to be let in. The armchair detective didn't just watch the story, he changed the ending. What struck me here was the silence. Not the silence of the victims, but the silence of our own conscience. As I sit here in 2026, looking at the mountain of new evidence, the recovered search histories, the cell tower data, the secret WhatsApp logs, and the prison confessions, I am forced to confront a hard truth about how we treated the one man who saw this coming. We laughed. When Alan Gray, the armchair detective, sat in front of his computer 8 years ago and pointed at a grainy shadow under a truck, we laughed. We called him a conspiracy theorist. We called him obsessive. When he stood by Cindy and Ronnie Watts and argued that their son was a puppet dancing on someone else's strings, we got angry. We accused him of revictimizing Shannon's family. We accused him of selling false hope to grieving parents who couldn't accept reality. We felt superior because we trusted the system. We trusted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We trusted the 86-day investigation that wrapped everything up in a neat little bow. But, holding this file in my hands today, The laughter dies in my throat. Because when you strip away the mockery and look at the cold, hard data of 2026, you realize the impossible. The shadow was real. I do not mean that there was literally a physical child hiding under the bumper of that Ford truck at 5:17 in the morning. Maybe that specific cluster of pixels was just a trick of the light, a ghost in the machine. But Alan Gray wasn't looking at pixels, he was looking at truth. That shadow he pointed to was a metaphor for the dark, unseen presence that was looming over the entire case. It was the shadow of a second person. The thing is, Alan Gray told us that Nichol Kessinger was present at the crime scene. The experts said it was impossible. But the cell tower ping in Frederick at 6:16 in the morning now tells us she was there. He told us that Chris Watts was constantly looking for direction, that he was communicating with an invisible partner. The experts said he was just nervous. But the revelation of the secret, encrypted WhatsApp channel now tells us that those invisible lines of communication existed. He told us that the mistress was not a victim, but a calculator who was managing the fallout. The experts said she was innocent, but the recovered Google searches about Amber Frey book deals and how to delete texts now tell us that she was strategizing for fame and survival while the bodies were still being recovered. In other words, the armchair detective was right about the essence of the crime, even if he didn't have the forensic tools to prove it at the time. He saw the shadow of an accomplice when everyone else only saw a lone wolf. And this is important because it forces us to redefine what justice looks like. We tend to think of justice as a gavel banging in a courtroom. But in this case, justice was a man with a webcam refusing to let a story die. The shadow that Alan Gray saw wasn't just under the truck, it was the black cloud that hung over the entire rushed investigation. It was the shadow cast by a district attorney's office that prioritized speed over thoroughness, closing a quadruple homicide in just 86 days to avoid the messiness of a trial. That shadow covered up the back door on Verbena Court. It covered up the deleted messages. It covered up the inconsistencies in the timeline. Alan Gray spent 8 years trying to shine a light into that shadow, and for his trouble, he was ridiculed. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a vindication that is both satisfying and heartbreaking. Satisfying because the truth has finally caught up to the instinct. But heartbreaking because we realize that if the authorities had listened to the questions being raised by the crazy internet sleuths back in 2018, we might not be sitting here 8 years later wondering if an accomplice walked free. What I found was that we owe the Watts family, and specifically Chris's parents, an apology. We judged them for listening to Alan Gray. We thought they were delusional for believing their son was manipulated. But as Chris Watts sits in his cell today, writing letters about the Jezebel who planned everything, we have to admit that his parents knew him better than we did. They knew he was a follower, and Alan Gray was the only one brave enough to validate that intuition. At this point, the legacy of the armchair detective is no longer up for debate. He proved that in the digital age, the official narrative is not always the true narrative. He proved that sometimes you have to look at the blurry edges of the frame to see the picture clearly. Alan Gray might not be a detective with a badge and a gun. He might not have a degree in forensics, but he possesses something far more valuable, the courage to stare into the dark. He looked at the pitch-black void of this case for so long and with such intensity that the darkness eventually had no choice but to reveal its secrets. He saw the ghost in the machine. And now, thanks to him, so do we. This case is no longer just about Chris Watts. It is about the failure of a system that wanted to sleep, and the triumph of a community that stayed awake. The shadow under the truck has finally moved. It has stepped out into the light, and it has a name. Thank you for watching, and for refusing to let the truth stay buried in the dark.